So what I'm going to talk about really are the main themes which I've covered in my new book on the housing crisis in London and the ramifications that has for the rest of the UK. The key theme really that the book is based on is this idea that life at the top of the super prime property market in London is linked to the terrible housing conditions at the bottom. And underpinning it is, you've heard already from Mike in the morning about Thomas Piketty's book. Thomas Piketty's ideas about the income from property, the income from rent being greater than the income from economic growth and from wages are at the heart of all the arguments I make and are what's driving today's property economy in the UK, this casino-style property economy, which has seen this huge glut of foreign investment pour into London. And the argument I make is that this is directly linked, in fact, to the displacement of communities from London and the destruction of public housing. So I'm going to attempt to explain that. So I opened the book actually with this paragraph here. This is actually a friend of mine, and I saw this post on Facebook just as I was finishing the book. And she wrote, "Surrounded by boxes yet again, about to move, knowing that we will be moving again in the new year. I have cleaned and painted the new flat and it's still a dump with damp patches and a moth-eaten carpet throughout. I am 46 and I have lived in over 30 houses and I still have no security." She's a university graduate. She has a really good job earning more than 40,000 a year. Her partner works. They've got 2 children and one is sleeping in an alcove under the stairs. And, you know, all the responses elicited no surprise to that situation. Okay, so we all know about these horrific events. This fire, Grenfell Tower, happened in one of the most deprived wards in the country, which is part of one of the richest parts of London, one of the richest parts of the UK, the highest concentration of billionaires, in fact, in the world, live in this borough. I see 2 big factors behind this tragedy: a total failure of accountability. Residents warned again and again that something like this was going to happen. They weren't listened to. Part of the reason they weren't listened to was because of the structures, the company which now manages this housing in place of a democratically elected local authority. It was also a failure of regulation and the ideological belief of the government that we've had since 2010 that regulation is red tape, and they had refused to amend the building regulations following a similar fire in 2009. Okay, I want to show how this is linked to the London that we're creating today. This is actually a CGI image, a computer-generated image of the sorts of developments that we're seeing going up all over London. And probably you're familiar with this kind of development in Dublin as well. This, in fact, is not a CGI image, it's a real image. It's Elephant Park. It's the new development which has replaced the now demolished Haygate estate in Elephant and Castle. And you can see the hoarding next to it of the sort of development that it's going to be. This is the park. Apparently, this is the biggest public park in London since Victorian times. I'm dwelling on Elephant Park because we're going to come back to Elephant Park and the Haygate estate because it's a very apt illustration of what's been going on. So remember this one. This is a CGI of the new development around Battersea Power Station. It's going up at the moment, actually very similar to what you see here. Frank Gehry, Norman Foster, you know, the sort of the pinnacle of luxury London. And this is the ultimate symbol, the Sky Pool, a swimming pool suspended 10 stories between 2 tower blocks in the Vauxhall Nine Elms development. I think this is called Embassy Gardens, just near the US Embassy. So this has been seen as a symbol of what's happening. You know, the super rich can literally look down on everyone else while they do their lengths. And these are the iceberg basements. I don't know if these have arrived in London, but they're all over Kensington and Chelsea and the other so-called alpha parts of the city. Iceberg because you can only see this iceberg bit on the front, and underneath is this. This is obviously a particularly lavish one, but you know, archaeologists of contemporary London will see these catacombs and they'll realise what was going on. And so we've seen this influx of enormous wealth into London, the so-called Monaco group, the most billionaires and ultra-high net worth individuals clustered in parts of London like Notting Hill Gate, St John's Wood, Highgate. Also the links, the Panama Papers you're familiar with, offshore, the whole sort of glut of money laundering, money coming into London, the kleptocrats, and the phenomenon of lights out London, all this property bought up simply as a safety deposit box in the sky, an investment not to be lived in. So these parts of London actually late at night are dark, you know, no one's there. So, you know, the argument is, among many politicians, you know, isn't it good to bring all this wealth into the city because it will trickle down to the parts that need it the most? And that's been the argument ever since the whole sort of Reaganomics Thatcherite revolution began. Bring loads of finance capital into places like Canary Wharf, the new financial centre in London. And, you know, that will help the whole city. A rising tide floats all boats. But, you know, we know now that that's a myth, a lie. It doesn't happen. What happens is that wealth does trickle down, but instead of benefiting communities, it displaces them. And we've seen this happen now, where the old English elites have been displaced from Kensington and Chelsea. They move out, perhaps, out of London. Their parents buy the kids' homes in other parts of slightly sort of formerly unfashionable parts of London, Acton, Peckham, Forest Gate, which in turn gentrify, displace the existing residents out of the city altogether. And all of this is accompanied by soaring rents as well. Now rents are more than 50% of average rents are more than 50% of income for all Londoners, and some terrible conditions which I'll tell you about. And you know, again, people sometimes say this is simply gentrification. Haven't got time to explain gentrification to you, but you're familiar with the term, I'm sure. This is not gentrification. You know, this is a completely different phenomenon. Gentrification related to a far slower process which occurred between the 1960s and the noughties. But this is a post-2008 phenomenon which is completely different, which rests on the huge amount of money brought in by quantitative investment, the magic money tree, which bailed out the banks. It rests on London's status as a tax haven, and it also rests on a policy of state-led gentrification, which I'll talk about now. So this is the Highgate estate. This was home to 3,000 people on predominantly low incomes. And if you remember the slides I showed you before of Elephant Park, it has now been turned into 2,800, I think, approximately luxury apartments, of which only 82 are social housing. So that is the level of demographic change that we're seeing. The Highgate was demolished in 2014 and construction of Elephant Park began. It's not just the Highgate. This is Robin Hood Gardens, internationally acclaimed modernist masterpiece, due for the chop any time now. And the narrative around these estates is that they're sink estates. You know, they're terrible places which blight the lives of residents. Let's knock them down and build mixed communities. But of course, you also get places like this. This is Cressingham Gardens, which overlooks Brockwell Park in South London, and nobody can describe this as a sink estate. In fact, the former head of REBA described it as one of the nicest small schemes in England, and there's been a massive campaign to save this estate, as well as every other estate. There are campaigns all across London. They've won a number of court battles, but at the moment it's tipped for demolition. So why is this happening? We've seen up to 100 estates demolished or in the process of being demolished, and many more are planned for demolition, at a time of acute housing crisis. Well, I've told you what the sort of the justification is. Oh, and by the way, this is being pursued as vigorously by Labour councils as it is by Conservative councils. The reason it's happening is this idea of the rent gap, which was a term coined by the geographer Neil Smith. And this is a very good explanation, I think, of what the rent gap actually means. Andrew Adonis said this in an interview in the Financial Times. Andrew Adonis is a former Labour cabinet minister. He's currently the chair of the National Infrastructure Commission, and he's been very, very engaged in promoting this policy. He's actually said he would like it to spread far wider than London's 6 estates, to cover every single one of London's 3,500 estates. And what he said is the scale of council-owned land is vast and greatly underappreciated. There are particularly large concentrations of council-owned land in inner London, and this is some of the highest priced land in the world. The local authority planning regime has got to adapt properly to the potential for market-priced rent developments. And this is the result. This is Elephant Park. Prices range from £750,000 to £1 million for a 2-bed apartment. Now, what the developer will say, and the local authority, is that 25% of these are actually affordable housing. But the Conservatives changed the definition of affordable housing to mean up to 80% of market rent. So, you can see how affordable that is. And what's happened to the people? Well, this is what's happened to the tenants. The majority of them have been displaced out of the borough. Communities have been broken up. Kids have been, have had to leave their schools. But actually, it's the homeowners, Margaret Thatcher's right to buy homeowners, who've really, I think this is the biggest scandal of all. They've been given such low levels of compensation for their properties that they've had to leave London altogether, being displaced really very far outside of the city, and this has led to huge human cost, depression, mental health problems, elderly residents have died in the process. It's a phenomenal scandal what is going on. So I don't know how I'm doing for time. Okay, I've got some complicated slides coming up because this is in the context of the erosion of social housing over the last 30 years, and now actually the sort of, it's in its death throes. And I've got a chapter in the book called From Bricks to Benefits, which explains how we stopped building council housing and we instead turned upon a reliance on the private rented sector to house people on social housing and to pay for that through housing benefit. So we sold off our council housing, we sold off 2 million homes through Right to Buy, and we saw a shift to housing associations. Well, we've heard housing associations mentioned already. They're not always that great. And alongside housing associations, some of the housing stock underwent a PFI process, which has led to huge problems, and some of them became ALMOs, these arm's length management organisations. And it is an ALMO, an arm's length management organisation, which is responsible for all the housing in Kensington and Chelsea. And the lack of accountability there, I think, has been very, very clear to see. We've seen the marketisation in recent years of housing benefit as well. So now we have this issue whereby housing benefit no longer covers all the rent of social housing. So in fact, tenants in London cannot afford to pay their rents with housing benefit because it has been capped, while at the same time the housing benefit bill has soared because private landlords rent out former council homes at 3 to 4 times the price. So the whole policy is entirely nonsensical. It takes a bit longer to explain than I've actually got. But what we're seeing basically is that families are being exported out of London as far as Birmingham, Leeds and Middlesbrough. And this is a lady who lives in a terrible in Boundary House, which is a former nurses' home in Welwyn Garden City, where conditions are absolutely terrible. Single mums have been exported out there from East London. You know, this is the sort of thing they have to put up with. Some of them are sleeping sort of 3 and 4 to a room. Then we've got the sort of widespread phenomenon of generation rent, where, you know, this is something affecting, I'd say, sort of, you know, 50%, even 2/3. But yeah, I mean, it's affecting vast amounts of Londoners, middle-class Londoners, you know, people even on high incomes. And these are some of the terrible conditions at the bottom end, illegal conditions under what a phenomenon known as rent-to-rent, where basically homes are sublet, rooms are sublet, and actually bed spaces are rented. And this is what you're seeing in London. These are beds in sheds, which are certainly at the illegal end of the spectrum. And people trafficking has been associated with this phenomenon, which actually covers, you know, thousands actually of properties like this. What's the upshot? Well, people are leaving London, unsurprisingly. There's a 14 to 18% vacancy rate for nursing. Teaching is down 16%. And it's not just public services, it's business as well, which is incredibly worried. There's this a business-led group, including the CBI, which claims that on current trends, customer services and sales staff will be pushed out at every level. But also a lot of people are staying. And actually, it's this idea of hedonic adjustment. You just start to change your expectations. You put up with unacceptable conditions. So Jan, with whom I opened the book, said, well, you know what's great about the new place? Actually, the heating works, which it didn't before. You know, it's things like that. So how have we come to this? Well, I don't think I've got time to explain, but essentially, the planning and housing system was created alongside the NHS and the post-war welfare state. And it was created to include mechanisms which meant that the increasing price of land, which came automatically with the granting of planning permission, those huge increases in the price of land actually would be recouped back for the benefit of the community and the provision of affordable housing. And we have seen that mechanism basically being chipped away. It was finally removed in 1986, the mechanism being a form of land tax, which was finally removed in 1986 by Nigel Lawson. And the system since then hasn't functioned at all in the way that it should have. And now it's just led to this farcical situation where house builders can get away with building virtually no affordable housing. And you can see their profits. The profits of the top 5 house builders rose by 480% between 2010 and 2015. So they're getting away with murder on the scale that the bankers were. So just to end, really, repeat, really, the conclusions already drawn by Rory and by Javier, that we need to build housing outside the market. The market is not ever going to provide affordable housing for all. I like the notion of the right to the city, which sees the city as a contested space and not as a market-led monoculture. And this has been enshrined in the UN Habitat 3's New Urban Agenda. Is that going to make any difference? Well, it's there. You know, it's a lever that can be used to bring about legislative change. Anyway, I better end it there.
Now, I don't want to impress upon you too much about the short time we're under. So the rule about questions is this. If it begins with a what and a why, it's probably a question. So questions, please. First gentleman.
What has been the effect of the fight back against evictions in Barcelona? Because we are looking at an increase in evictions here now over the next year, and particularly if the government goes ahead and sells 25% of our AIB.
Okay, thank
Any
you.
lessons that we can learn from Barcelona on that?
Thank you. Any further questions? At the back, Prunches, please.
Try and frame this as a quick question. Why don't we accept the Commission's statement that there is flexibility in the fiscal rules? They've already said it, and yet we continually hear claims to the contrary. Why don't we change the Constitution to give a better balance to social responsibilities of government as distinct from responsibilities to the market? There's ample evidence that there is a need to do that. Why don't we do it? And the final question is, why don't we look at what the European Parliament said back in 2011, that there's a need to change the state aid rules in order to enable housing societies and other social services to deliver services at the ground level using public funds as well as volunteer organisations.
Thank you, Prunches. I'll take two more questions, one beginning with what, one beginning with why. At the back, Dr. Mary Murphy, please.
Why do we persist with the right to buy? It came up in the last session that when Tom Beattie was talking about the rent initiative, that he wouldn't have a right to buy in it. But like, to my understanding, if we didn't have the right to buy in Irish policy, we'd be 30,000 housing stock up. Even in the last 20 years, I think we've sold that many houses out in right to buy. So I'm just wondering why you persist with selling off our housing stock.
Okay. Last question for our guests, specific to perhaps London or Barcelona, if you don't mind.
To Anna Minton, any signs of hope in London?
There's always hope. Okay, thank you. Okay, let's start from the top. Javier, what has been the effect of the fight back against evictions in Barcelona, please?
Well, we have established a new unit. We have something that is rather new over there. Is social workers and housing public workers working together. So the approach is 50% social services, 50% housing public action. They are, first of all, tracing all the cases, and I'm not mistaken with the words. The first problem is that we don't know how many forced evictions are going to be, because the judicial authorities, they state that adults, they have the right to ask for public aids, but they don't have the obligations. So we can't have the precise data of the day and hour of the forced evictions because they don't want us to enter into action. So the first problem is to trace the cases. The second problem is to engage in a negotiation with the property. And we have several different types of public aids in order to avoid the forced eviction. The tough thing is that we are not successful with the negotiations all the time, so the evictions, sometimes take place, and we don't have enough stock in order to house everybody properly. So we are using hostels, hotels, and other different facilities in order to avoid people to sleep in the street. And those persons, then afterwards, they are treated within the system, and they have the possibility to escalate to a proper social housing. But we don't have enough units for everybody, so we are employing a great deal of resources. We are doing our best. It's a very tough, emotionally speaking, it's a very tough job to do. We are not successful because we can't cope with the size of the problem, and other administrations are looking to the opposite side. So the program is successful in the sense that we have means, specific means for the problem. We cover most of the cases. We give responses that maybe they are not the best responses, but still is a response. But we have this frustration of not being able to solve all the situations, and the sensation that it will get bigger.
Okay, thank you. And perhaps to just connect the last question in terms of this as well, in terms of hope and activism in London on housing issues, and perhaps to take a cue from our issues, our discussion of populism. I think it's reported just now or recently this afternoon that Jeremy Corbyn is asking for the seizure of luxury apartments in London for the housing of people displaced by Grenfell Tower. Is that just... is that populist enough, do you think?
Yeah, I think. I mean, obviously the election, Freudian slip, the unexpected success of Jeremy Corbyn in the election, is hugely hopeful, because it shows that, I think it shows that we've reached a tipping point, and there's widespread support for a very different sort of platform and a manifesto which was much more underpinned by social justice concerns. So that's enormously hopeful. But having said that, I mentioned in the presentation, all the housing estate demolition, estate regeneration it's called, is actually, Labour councils are spearheading a lot of this. And what I've hoped is that Jeremy Corbyn had to choose his battles. And, he's had enough battles, and he probably thought Labour councils, a lot of which are run, the ones which are in the vanguard, Southwark, Lambeth, are run by the Progress right-wing faction of the Labour Party. He probably thought, I won't take them on this. And actually, the Shadow Housing Minister is not a progressive type either. But I hope that he will be looking at his housing policy, and I hope that this will become part of it.
Okay, so the right to buy and tenant purchasing and so forth. But why is that still popular? Why are we persisting with it?
If it's anything like it is in the UK, obviously it's popular because it's popular for the people who get the opportunity to do it. But I think I see it as part of the sort of much wider capture of housing policy by a purely neoliberal agenda. It's part of that from bricks to benefits. Rather than people having subsidised homes of their own, they can just, go into the private rented sector on benefit or perhaps on capped benefit, and we will marketise the provision of housing, which simply doesn't work.
And Javier, from Barcelona's perspective?
Yeah, from outspace, because in order to have a judgment on the right to buy, you have to have a public, cooperative and limited profit rental stock to be sold to begin with. And we are not in that position. So, of course, I'm against the right to buy. I think is another part of the problem, not a part of the solution. But if you step aside and to try to think about the system as a whole, I would say that no isolated tool by itself, it has the magical solution. The problem is that we have to combine many things. We have to combine market, limited profit, public, local, big scale, rental, lease, right of surface, and maybe some types of ownership. For example, this is a very marginal example. It's only happening in the northern part of Spain. Our vivienda protegida, our protected housing in the Basque Country is always protected. It doesn't become never ever market housing, so it can be sold at market prices. Is that a social tool to sell houses, very good quality houses, units, at 120 or 130,000 euros for median average working families? No, this is not social policy, we know it. But is it deflationary? Are we going against the tendencies of the market with a structural tool that can reduce the average price? Yes, it is. So I wouldn't demonize any method, any tool, any system, and I will try to look for the combination of different tools that work in different situations. Of course, I don't have the answers, but to demonize one tool by itself, I think is not good.
You had a rejoinder?
Yeah, just one thing on the right to buy. The massive problem with the right to buy in the UK, I don't know about here, is that councils were forbidden from using the money they made, the capital receipts, in order to build new housing. And subsequent to that, 40% of the housing, the council housing sold, has been sold on to private landlords who now rent it out at 3 and 4 times the price of the local authority rents. So, you know, we now have a system where no one is investing in the social housing stock as a result.
Which, by the way, I think is against free competition.
Competition, and you raise its head.
There is a public body which is not allowed to compete
Yes.
with private bodies.
Okay, that's a nice cue for to reflect back on Prunch's question. Just to say that the Tories were actually very, very good at doing more than that. They actually brought in restrictions on the interest that was borne on the capital receipts underneath the housing revenue account. You may remember that. Certainly Linda does, I'm sure. Just to come back to, if you don't mind if I merge it a little, Prunches, you know, why or would there be a European Commission competency on housing if the Parliament was to adopt a constitutional position in Europe on housing? Is it possible to see that type of, or envisage that type of?
I mean, the point I really took away from this morning was, I think James said, if the EU doesn't develop a social policy on housing, I think you said, you know, it's going to fall apart.
Yes.
And I think that's absolutely right.
Okay. Javier, what would you think?
We are not expecting much help from Brussels. Let's put it this way. I think they are devoting much more time to put in jeopardy systems that are already well functioning than to fostering systems that want to emerge. And I'm sad because among other things I live 1 year in Belgium and it's a country that I love. But we are not expecting
much
help,
assistance from
much help.
Brussels. Okay, well that's interesting. We're all.
Special cases like Ireland.
Well, we are.
42% of the debt under a special case.
Yes.
We are a systemic risk. We are a 45 million inhabitants country, the southern border, in the southern border, and our economy it weighs 1 trillion euros.
Yes.
So even though it's a very unequal and the country has many problems, we are too big to fall.
Too big to
so
fail.
they will have to do something sooner or later.
Okay. I think we have time, if I may, for maybe 1 or 2 more questions. So, please, Paul. And there's somebody at the back as well. And Cian. How question?
In your views, do we strike a balance between the undoubted popularity of Airbnb and its negative impact on properties for rent?
And Cian, Dr. Cian O'Callaghan, Trinity College.
Hi, a question for Anna. On the relationship between vacant property and luxury developments in London, is there a point where the preponderance of vacant properties or vacant luxury properties makes property in London lose value?
Thank you very much. Anna, we'll start with you, please.
Well, it doesn't seem to have so far. I mean, you know, you've got, I think, 25% vacant property in boroughs like the one where the tower, Grenfell Tower, caught fire, going up to, I think, 40% in the West End, and those are the highest value parts of London. But I think something like Jeremy Corbyn's call maybe could have an impact, but if that ever comes to light, you know, that could just be posturing.
Okay, just be having for fun.
I mean, if you look at Manhattan, they've got the same issue going on there.
Yes.
So it's just simply an investment.
Okay. And on the question of Airbnb,
Yeah, on the balance between popularity and the damage that is causing. First of all, I don't know if it's that popular. At least, according to the surveys that are being carried out in the city of Barcelona, more than half of the population, they believe, I believe, I am among them, that we have gone too far in terms of the touristification of the economy, which it doesn't mean that tourism is not a very nice activity, that we should have some part of our economy should be relating on tourism. It's a problem of quantity and spatial distribution. Also, where is taking place, all these things is important. But the answer, I think, is very simple. It's very old-fashioned. Fashion is almost from the 19th century. you have to obtain permits. If the activity is regulated, you need to comply with the legal standards, and you have to pay taxes. It sounds extremely old-fashioned,
Yes.
but it goes this way. I mean, if you are making money, we don't have anything against economic activity, and we don't have anything against private revenue. Everything's perfect, but do it legally. Follow the standards of quality, of equipment, and everything else, and pay taxes.
Well,
and on top of this, in the city of Barcelona, we have developed a spatial planning tool, which prescribes that in one zone, in several zones, but in one type of zones, we have to decrease. In other type of zone, we can maintain the level of tourist activity, and in the other part of the city, you are free to do whatever you want because we have less than our capacity. So, very, very simple. Town planning, permissions, complying with standards, and paying taxes.
Okay, so there's the hope. Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to ask you to show your appreciation, please, for our two speakers.